I got the message from Melissa while sitting in my small office on the 14th floor overlooking the stretch of I-277 cutting through Charlotte. She said she wanted a divorce, that she'd found someone who made her feel alive again. The second message came almost immediately after. She had transferred our entire retirement savings into her personal account. She told me I could keep the house. I didn't react. Just set my coffee down and opened the financial dashboard. I didn't need long to check. The automated system I built to monitor every account movement had already flagged the transaction. A chain of fraud detection protocols had been triggered before I even read the first text. Large transfer, no dual authorization, from a retirement account, blocked, frozen, pending federal review. I sent her a single line in return. No anger, no confrontation. I didn't need to. My entire life had been built on numbers and risk control frameworks. What she had tried to bypass was the very system I'd spent nearly 2 decades designing. I turned back to my work. A client needed help reviewing fraud detection algorithms. Melissa would soon realize her account balance was zero, and this time she'd have no one to blame but herself. I first met Melissa in 1999 when we were both seniors at UNC Charlotte. I was studying finance. She was majoring in communications. She was the most outgoing person in the room, always commanding attention. I sat in the back row, the kind of guy who filled 3 pages of notes when everyone else scribbled half a line. We weren't alike, and maybe that was the point. We got married 3 years later in a small lakeside ceremony. Nothing extravagant, just family and a few close friends. Melissa rose quickly in the media world events conference's major clients. I stayed behind the scenes designing systems, streamlining financial processes for businesses. She liked to call me her perfect background support, and I didn't mind. I believed in the value of stability and preparing for things most people didn't want to think about. We bought the house in South Charlotte 5 years into our marriage. A 2-story with a big backyard and a porch wide enough for a coffee table. I still remember how Melissa smiled when she stepped into the kitchen for the first time. She said this would be the place we'd grow old together. I believed her. When she moved to Callisto Media, her schedule got heavier and work trips became the norm. I didn't mind. I was proud of her, and I poured even more focus into my own work. From building client portfolios to developing a personal financial monitoring system, the very one that would later save me. We weren't perfect, but we were steady. No big fights, no warning signs that screamed trouble. There were nights we just sat beside each other, each with a laptop, not saying much, but feeling close all the same. I thought that was enough. Turns out I was wrong. The changes started small, so small that if I hadn't been paying close attention, I might have brushed them off. Melissa used to ask about our retirement plan often. Then one day she just stopped. No more questions about return rates or inflation forecasts. She would just nod quietly whenever I mentioned investments. At first I figured she was tired, too busy to care. But the silence lingered. Everything started shifting slowly. Quietly. There was no single moment I could point to. Just small things slipping out of their usual place, subtle enough to seem accidental, consistent enough to raise unease. Melissa used to insist on making us both coffee every morning. It was her routine. But lately she'd be gone by the time I got up protein shake, finished dishes, washed kitchen spotless, like she had never been there. I once joked that she was living like a long-term Airbnb guest. She gave me a faint smile but said nothing, walking away as if the words had never been spoken. She talked less, not cold exactly, but distant in a careful, deliberate way. A light touch on my shoulder as she passed, but never a glance. A nod when I talked about work, but no follow-up questions. It felt like living with someone polite, respectful, but no longer emotionally present. I noticed she was spending more time in her home office. The door started closing during meetings, then locking. That room, once a shared creative space, had become a private zone I wasn't invited into. I asked once what project she was working on. She said it was a pitch deck for a big client. I didn't see any drafts lying around like before. Her clothes changed too, even at home. The old oversized t-shirts were gone, replaced by sleek fitted athletic wear. Always ready. Like she had just come from the gym or was on her way somewhere. Her perfume changed too. No longer the soft floral scent I'd grown used to. Now it was bold, sharper, the kind worn by someone trying to feel new again. At first, I chalked it up to a phase midlife recalibration stress, the odd melancholy that follows milestone birthdays. But the pattern kept building. Melissa wasn't just shifting routines. She was easing herself out of the marriage. Quietly. No announcement. No big confrontation. Just subtle gestures and growing silence that said more clearly than words ever could, she was already leaving. One morning, while checking our transaction logs, I noticed a new credit card under her name. It wasn't a big deal on its own, we didn't police each other's spending. But Melissa had always been someone who talked, first acted later. This time, there was no heads up. No sticky note on the fridge like she used to leave. I looked deeper and found a string of spa and restaurant charges I didn't recognize. One name repeated 3 times: Asteria Wellness. Our conversations shifted too. Long talks after dinner became nods and one-word replies. She'd retreat to the bedroom earlier, often taking her laptop with her. I didn't ask why. Not because I didn't notice, but because I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. The night before she flew to San Diego, Melissa asked a question I'll never forget. She wanted to know exactly how much we had in our retirement accounts. I told her around $800,000. She nodded. Said nothing. No follow-up, no compliment, no remark about how far we'd come. Just a quiet nod, and then she went back to packing. That was the moment I knew something was off. But I didn't say it out loud. I just stood there looking at the woman I'd shared 20 years with and realized I no longer knew what she was thinking. The call came on a Friday morning, while I was in a client meeting about a new audit tool. Melissa said her credit card wasn't working. She was trying to keep her voice even, but I could hear the edge of panic. I asked if she had checked her balance. She said it was 0. She had already made the transfers. Now the money was gone. I explained the system had automatically flagged the transaction. It was a large withdrawal, lacking dual authorization, and matched known red flags. Federal compliance protocols froze it, 5 to 7 business days, possibly longer if further investigation was needed. I didn't elaborate. She said nothing more, then hung up. I wasn't angry. What I felt was clarity. 20 years of building trust. 20 years believing we were on the same side. And she tried to bypass the very system I designed to protect both of us. But the pain wasn't about the money. It was in the efficiency of the betrayal. No discussion. No hesitation. Just a transfer. Then silence. Like closing a deal. I reopened my financial logs, the personal risk detection framework I'd built to monitor every shared and shadow account. What she didn't know was that even the accounts in her name were connected to behavioral flags I had quietly configured. Her activities had been tracked from the first misstep. The next morning, I met with Jordan Pratt, my divorce attorney. A direct man, no fluff. He advised filing immediately before she retained counsel. I agreed. No alimony requests, no battle over protected assets. The house stayed in my name. The joint account remained untouched, $3,000. Melissa could have that if she needed it. I didn't want her destitute. I just didn't want her thinking she could vanish with $800,000 and no one would notice. 3 days later, I got a call from Alan Schaefer, Melissa's manager at Callisto Media. He asked if she was really attending a conference in San Diego. HR had no records of her being there. I didn't give a clear answer. Just said she was on a business trip and I wasn't aware of the details. Alan hesitated, then added that there were discrepancies in her expense reports. Refund requests that shouldn't have been approved. Patterns going back 18 months. It all started unraveling at once. I widened the query parameters on my system. More anomalies surfaced. A series of fund transfers from corporate to personal accounts. All from the same IP address, our home, her login. Then came the second call. Our real estate agent said a buyer was trying to purchase our house for $300,000, the original price we paid 5 years ago. The buyer's name was Jared Collins. I didn't know the name, but the number raised alarms. The house was now worth close to $500,000. No one offers the old price unless they're part of the plan. I sat down, pulled the logs again. Money transfers, credit pulls, shadow account creations. One name appeared repeatedly across IP traces: Jared Collins. Disposable email addresses, proxy activity. I saw it clearly now. Melissa was coordinating with a third party to sell the house below market value, then likely flip or reclaim it through a proxy for real profit. A simple laundering scheme. And I, who had built the safeguards, had nearly missed it. But the system didn't. It had spoken. And this time, it wasn't just saving me. It was uncovering something far bigger than marriage. Tuesday morning, Mecklenburg County Courthouse. The sky hung low and gray, drizzle streaking the windows. I arrived 20 minutes early, not out of nervousness, but to see things clearly without rush. The third-floor hallway smelled like damp wood and stale coffee. A few women sat quietly with divorce papers on their laps, their faces drained of emotion. Everyone looked like they were just waiting for something to end. Melissa arrived on time, not early, not late. She wore a gray blazer and black slacks, her hair tied neatly, still carrying that poised, professional air she used to have when hosting major events. But her eyes had changed harder, guarded, rehearsed. She didn't look at me, just sat beside her attorney. Angela Monroe, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who held a red pen like it could cross someone's name off a list at any moment. Jordan, my lawyer, was the opposite. Quiet, deliberate. He didn't need to raise his voice. When he stood, his presence filled the room with calm weight. His words landed like ledgers, clear, final. Angela opened with claims that her client was in a state of temporary financial distress, unable to afford basic living expenses, and that freezing all retirement assets constituted a financial act of harm, possibly manipulative in nature. Jordan responded with a single line. He requested the court display the joint account statement. The screen showed $3.87. He calmly explained it was the standard emergency reserve we had always maintained, untouched, fully accessible to Melissa. Angela shifted tactics, implying my system may have been manually manipulated. Jordan nodded and opened a technical brief, a compiled log file from the detection software. It confirmed that all actions taken were automatic, triggered by regulatory thresholds. No edits, no unauthorized access. The judge scanned the papers, then placed them down. He saw no reason to approve any additional financial support. I didn't look at Melissa throughout the hearing, but I could feel her glancing sideways now and then, maybe wondering why, maybe wondering how I could be so calm. I didn't respond. I wasn't there for revenge. I was there because the system had worked, and it deserved to finish what it started. When the judge issued the ruling denying supplemental access and permitting only the joint account, Melissa's shoulders sank slightly. No tears, no outburst, just a small, almost imperceptible sigh. The kind of sound I'd heard once before, the day she lost her first major client contract. Quiet, internal, dignified, but broken on the inside. She stood and walked straight out the door. No glance back. A week late, I was contacted by Victor Delgado, a federal investigator from the Eastern Financial Compliance Division. He asked to meet at my office during a 90-minute conversation. I began to understand the full scope of what had been uncovered. Victor explained that my system had unintentionally flagged a series of transactions tied to embezzlement within Callisto Media's marketing department. They had started tracking Melissa based on the alerts from my system specifically, the transfers between her personal and corporate accounts. That led them to another name, Jared Collins. Not just a fake buyer, he was part of it. One of the core players in a broader laundering and asset diversion network, according to Victor. They had identified at least 5 other employees in the same department, all involved in siphoning corporate marketing budgets into personal accounts, then looping the money back into real estate through proxy buyers. The preliminary losses were estimated at $2 million, and Melissa was one of the main coordinators, the one who tracked the flows, cleaned the trails, and made sure no red flags appeared internally. I sat there and listened, didn't interrupt. A part of me wanted to scream, to ask her when it started, and why I, the one who trusted her most, was used as cover. But another part knew better. I'd lived long enough with systems to understand truth doesn't stay buried. My job was to keep the data, testify when needed, and let the system do what it was built for. After the court hearing, things went quiet. Melissa didn't reach out. No calls, no messages. I figured she was waiting for her lawyer to find a new angle, or maybe she just had nothing left to say. On the 4th day, I got the first call from the county detention center. Her voice was hoarse and tired. She didn't ask how I was, She just said all her accounts had been frozen, her cards weren't working, and she couldn't pay for anything. She asked me to confirm with the bank that the transactions were authorized. I told her calmly that I would only speak to the facts, not to defend, not to accuse. She went silent, then hung up without another word. The next day, Angela Monroe, her attorney, called Jordan. They wanted to negotiate a humanitarian allowance, something they described as an act of kindness. Jordan simply repeated what had been true from the beginning. The joint account still held over $3,000 untouched. Melissa was free to use it, but she would not get a bailout. We weren't in the business of staging mercy. I didn't feel relief. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was silence, thick and steady, like the air after rain. I didn't want her to suffer financially, but I also couldn't save her from the story she had written for herself and dismantled with her own hands. A few days later, I received an email from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They formally requested full system logs, alert summaries, linked account histories, and any data related to the financial monitoring system I had built. I spent 2 nights reviewing every line of code, every warning alert, every timestamp tied to Melissa's activity. Some transactions were made less than a week after she told me she still loved me. I handed over everything, including a separate file, a list of all flagged anomalies that hadn't been addressed by human eyes errors, missed by internal audits, but clearly caught by the system. Among them were a series of withdrawals and asset shifts from her company that led to accounts linked to anonymous identities. Victor Delgado, the federal investigator, invited me to his office that Wednesday. He handed me a printed list, 12 people, 12 families. They were employees from different companies. But they had something in common. Their homes had been jointly owned, then suddenly sold under market value to a third party. The buyers were different, but the methods were the same. One name had gone to college with Melissa, another had worked with her on a marketing team. I sat there, staring at the list. Some addresses were less than 10 miles from mine. One family had hosted their kid's birthday party at our house 2 years ago. I remembered the robot cake and the boy with glasses grinning as Melissa sang. That house was now part of a series of properties flipped under manipulated terms, stripped of value and renamed like no one had ever called it home. Victor said my system hadn't just caught fraud. It had triggered a federal investigation. None of those families had known they were victims until my system logs brought their stories into daylight. I was asked to testify as a technical witness. My job would be to explain how the system worked, how it detected laundering patterns, how it flagged activity corporate auditors couldn't see by glancing at quarterly reports. I agreed. No hesitation. Angela submitted one final request. Melissa wanted me to speak to her character, that we'd been married 20 years, that I knew her well enough to call this a misstep. I declined. I said I'd testify to what I'd seen. No more. No less. I wasn't there to rescue anyone's reputation. I didn't represent our marriage. I represented the system. In truth, that was the only obligation I still owed to what was left of us. I walked into the federal courthouse on a December morning colder than usual. The courtroom was wide, harshly lit, with long wooden benches and a row of dark suits stretching from wall to wall. No one cried. No one looked shocked. Here, everything moved by protocol documents, timestamps, evidence, testimony. I testified twice. The first time was to explain how the system worked, its alert structure, the threshold parameters, how it classified and processed data automatically without human input. The government's attorneys asked me to clarify how the algorithm identified recurring transaction patterns, how it separated routine activity from laundering attempts. I answered with the clarity of someone who no longer had anything to hide. The second time, they asked about my relationship with Melissa, whether I had suspected anything. I said no. I trusted her, right to the end. And because I trusted her, I built the system to see what I could not, what emotions would never let me see. Then Melissa took the stand. She stood in a gray suit, hair tied low, no makeup. Gone was the polished presence, the confident gestures. She looked like someone who had let go. but hadn't fully collapsed. I sat 2 rows behind, and for the first time in months, I looked at her closely. Not to find answers, just to confirm that the woman standing there was no longer the one I used to know. She testified that in the beginning, it had only been temporary budget reallocations to speed up event expenses. That accounting was slow, and she thought she'd reimburse the company once the client payments cleared. But then approvals stalled. No one followed up. No one noticed. And when silence followed, she assumed the system hadn't caught it. She said the first transfer to her personal account kept her up for 3 nights. That she wasn't the kind of person who did things like this. That every time she logged in, she told herself it would be the last. But everything ran too smoothly. No questions, no flags, no oversight. Slowly, she began to believe she could control the damage. She didn't blame anyone. She didn't cite pressure. She simply said she got lost in the silence. That every time money showed up without resistance, it felt like permission. Not because she was greedy, but because it convinced her she was clever enough to outsmart everyone. About me, she said she never thought I'd notice. That I was too principled to suspect anything. That my trust was the best shield she had. When she said that, I saw her hand tremble slightly. No one expected her to cry. No one waited for her to beg. But the room grew quiet not out of pity, but because everyone understood some downfalls don't begin with malice. Just a wrong step, left unchecked. The prosecution played their final evidence a string of internal emails, a few spreadsheets with timestamp edits, and a recorded call in which Melissa said I would never check her company accounts. I sat there, listening to my own name folded into someone else's plan. A trust turned into a vulnerability, a belief used like a blind spot in code. When the judge found her guilty on all 12 counts: financial fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel pain. Just a quiet closure. The loop had completed. Everything was back where it belonged, and the system once again had done exactly what it was meant to do. After the trial, I didn't attend the press conference, didn't face the cameras, didn't speak to reporters. I simply walked out of the courthouse, got in my truck, and drove home. No music, no calls, no thoughts loud enough to name. It was just over. 2 months later, Melissa was sentenced to 18 years in federal prison. Jared Collins, the accomplice, and maybe more, got 9 years after pleading guilty and cooperating. Others in the network were called in one by one. Some lost jobs. Some paid restitution, but the heaviest price always falls on the one who draws the blueprint. I sold the old house for $49,500 market value. No losses. No backdoor deals. That was the only part I insisted on keeping intact: transparency. I bought a small single-story home in Asheville. Quiet. Anonymous. No one asked questions. I started teaching part-time at a nearby university, a class called Financial Fraud Detection. Not to tell my story, but because I believe systems, even simple ones, can still save people from what they don't see coming. I brought nothing with me but a few boxes of books, a coffee machine, and one file folder, handwritten letters from Melissa, sent from prison. In them, she wrote about how easy it had all become, how Jared told her the system could be tricked, and she chose to believe him over me. I kept the letters, didn't reread them, didn't reply, not out of hate, not out of forgiveness, just as part of the data, a piece of the case. 3 years later, the system I built still runs quietly, without emotion, flagging fraud while people fall in and out of love, make mistakes, and sometimes destroy themselves. I've learned to live the same way: clear, stable, without needing anyone to notice. Sometimes I drive past the old Callisto Media office, the company where Melissa once worked. It has a new name, a new leadership team, a completely overhauled finance department. But I know what happened there will always live in the system logs. No one can rewrite it. I don't think about her much anymore. Don't imagine what could have been. But some mornings, as I pour my coffee, I remember her eyes in that courtroom, not angry, not begging, just a quiet recognition that she had lost herself. I don't blame her now. I don't forgive either. Some things don't need to close with emotion. Betrayal happens. Fraud occurs. But systems endure. And sometimes, justice arrives, not with tears, not with rage, but through code, numbers, and the quiet patience of someone who chose not to strike back.